So I'm thrilled today to have as our two guests Patrice Maniglier on my far left and Peter Skafish just next to me, who I'll introduce them and just say a few words about them in a second. But the conversation today will be kind of around contemporary debates in metaphysics and ontology at the kind of intersection between philosophy and anthropology. Peter, whom I might as well begin by introducing, co-edited this volume that came out recently. It so happens that it was in a series that I direct, so if you want to buy it, then some magical way royalties will trickle down to both of us in the form of centimes or small change. This particular book, though, does give a very good overview of a lot of these debates, and Patrice's text that was in it is precisely one of the ones that we circulated. Now, Peter, and you can correct me if any of this is wrong, has a background in both anthropology and philosophy, trained at Berkeley, but then having done work in McGill, at the Collège de France here. And in addition to doing this volume, is well known for his work on Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who's one of the leading figures, having translated Cannibal Metaphysics and done a very important introduction in order to situate his work into these larger debates. Anything to correct on that front?
No, that's
my anthropology of Peter.
I'm an anthropologist, but that's fine for now.
Okay. And then Patrice Maniglier is teaches philosophy at Paris West Nanterre, is known for his work on the history of French thought, particularly structuralism and Lévi-Strauss. His work, though, is quite capacious because he engages extensively with contemporary debates in ontology and metaphysics. And so it's kind of the perfect duo that we have for once. What I hope we'll be able to do with this debate is situate some of these contemporary issues and why it is that there are really exciting things going on in anthropology today that we should be aware of. But then also I want to tease out from that the individual work that Patrice is doing in his contemporary projects and that Peter is doing as well, so that we can move between a kind of broad landscape of the debate itself to the specificity of the positions being taken in the debate. So what we decided in exchanging about the conversation that we'd have here today is that each of them will present, give a kind of brief presentation that we'll begin with, then we'll develop a kind of dialogue and exchange, and obviously at any point in time, anyone who wants to jump in is more than welcome. Otherwise, we'll follow the kind of chronology of discussion for about an hour and opening up for about a half hour. So I don't know, we didn't actually establish an order or sequence, and since there's infinite and multiple variation, we could probably get into a long debate about what sequence we should establish, but maybe you talked about it before. Who would like to kick things off?
Yes, yeah. Okay, I will start. And so this is a critical theory workshop, and what I would like to tell you today is that if you want to be critical, maybe you have to be metaphysical. This is what is going on today, so if you're interested in what is the hottest thing in town, it's not the climate, it's metaphysics, actually. And so this should come as a surprise to you.
There's a lot of metaphysics in this room now. It's very hot.
Well, but probably it heats the room. So it should come as a surprise for us, because we were accustomed to think that the critique of metaphysics, and in particular maybe the deconstruction of metaphysics, was really what was in the air, what defined the task of today. And what has happened in the last 10 years, I would say, is precisely this metaphysical turn. And I call it the metaphysical turn, even though you might be aware of the expression ontological turn in anthropology, which is, I think, a specific variant of this broader metaphysical turn. So that metaphysical turn is interesting because it concerns not only social sciences, not only anthropology, I will come back to anthropology more precisely, but also sociology. To a certain extent, the work of Latour belongs to the sociology of sciences at the beginning, and many other sociologists would probably be considered as interesting for us because they introduce metaphysics, or they consider metaphysics to be at the heart of what they do, but also economics and also philosophy, of course, which has become interested again in metaphysics. And in philosophy, you probably are aware of the debates around speculative realism. And speculative realism is a symptom or an expression of this return to metaphysics. Why? So it should come as a surprise again, because metaphysics was supposed to be a very sort of domineering, authoritative kind of discourse that would say the truth about what there is, if we believe Kant, in an a priori way, using reason itself, which is not that mysterious. Reason itself means using the principle of contradiction only. So the only thing you need to be true to, if you want to be metaphysical according to Kant, is not to fall into contradictions. And as you might be aware of, Kant was supposed to have shown that, well, metaphysics, that is, the use of conceptual reason by itself and only, was incapable of establishing anything in terms of what would be true about the world. It was capable of doing things in the practical reason, but not in the theoretical reason. So speculative realism is a way of claiming or reclaiming the possibility of having speculative truths. So ways of using your reason alone and establishing things that should be said true. So this is the very broad context, and so we could put names here. So I mentioned Latour at some point. So in the social sciences, the names that would be probably the most important ones would be Latour, Bruno Latour, Philippe Descola, who is professor at the Collège de France in Anthropology, Eduardo Viveros de Castro, that we mentioned, who is in Rio, and also Marilyn Strathern, who comes from Cambridge, and Tim Ingold, and even more recently, Eduardo Cohen, a good friend of Pete, who wrote that beautiful book called How Forests Think, and who belongs to this metaphysical turn into anthropology, because basically he claims that anthropology is not there to speak about the representation that we have about things, but to speak about things themselves. So this move from representation to... And in philosophy, it would be Quentin Meillassoux, Tristan Garcia, Graham Harman, who also started by commenting Latour, and also in the analytical world, which is quite interesting to mention, you also have this return to metaphysics, that is the idea that it's enough to analyze the language games, sort of run into a form of exploration, and for precise thematic reasons, really, they realized that in fact you could not have a description of a language without a description of the metaphysics or an ontology. Okay, so that's the general situation. So the way I entered into that debate was because I am, as Gabriel said, I am a historian of French philosophy of the 20th century, and my curiosity was how could we explain that such innovative philosophical projects like Deleuze's project, Foucault's, Derrida, Lyotard, and some others were linked to innovations in cultural social sciences, in linguistics, obviously, in anthropology, in literature theory, in psychoanalysis, in sociology, and so on. So I was interested in the relation between the two, and my guess, which actually appeared, I think, to be a thesis, meaning I can defend it, was that it's not for epistemological reasons, as we might have thought. That is, it's not because structuralism, to name it, changed the very way we understand rationality or we understand knowledge and so on. It was for ontological reasons. It was because it introduced a kind of being, which is the being of the sign, which was very specific, only because it is made only of differences, it is strictly positional, and in fact it is intrinsically variable. So I was interested in that, in tracing the points in which people in linguistics meet an ontological problem for accounting for their observations. That is, a language doesn't exist if you realize that its mode of existence is actually very weird, very, very weird. And tracing those things also in the way they move from one discipline to another, so from linguistics to anthropology, and so on. And working in anthropology on the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, I tried to show that the reason why Lévi-Strauss wanted to introduce structural methods in anthropology was to account and to be true to the very peculiar ontology of his own objects. So it's not that he thought that, or it's not because he thought that communication is the reality of culture, that he introduced the notion of the sign into anthropology. It's because that notion of the sign has very specific ontological features that can account for what anthropologists are interested in. And what are they interested in? Well, cultural variation, as you might say, all variations, or I would prefer to say variations of the like. That is, variations of people who are similar to me. The fact that someone who is like me, in fact, could be different. And so there are various threads in this, but basically the main conclusion I came to was to realize that basically what anthropologists are interested in are variants. So the notion of variant is the key notion for anthropology, except that if you want to understand what a variant is, well, it's not a variable. A variant is defined precisely by the way it could become different. So it's very positioned in a field of virtual transformation that gives it its identity, its determination. And that's one of the reasons why Lévi-Strauss introduced the notion of the sign in anthropology, because basically everything we do could be considered as a variant if we want to treat it in an anthropological way. Therefore, we have an ontological problem with that. It needs to be redefined through the ontology of the variant. So I was working in that direction, trying to show that there were ontological issues. And also, one very important thing is to realize that basically what the structuralists have shown, but forget about what you know about structuralism for some time, just believe me, at least. Now, then you can tell me that you have a problem with what you've learned about structuralism, but for one moment, just trust me. So what structuralists have shown is that precisely the problem, say, in linguistics, is not to understand what people say. That is, it's not that you have a kind of physical signal that you perceive, and then the question would be how you interpret it. The real problem is actually to determine what's going on here. So if I say a word in French, presumably for many of you, your problem would not be only that you don't understand it, it's you will be incapable of repeating it. You will be incapable of actually saying what has been said. And in fact, entering into a language is entering into a form of sensitivity. It's to perceive things. So perception is everything. So if you have a theory of the perception of how we get to perceive things, in fact, you have a theory of culture. So, and you could say the same thing about value, because we tend to think of value as something that is added to an entity that is given beforehand. But in fact, what Lévi-Strauss in his work on kinship has shown is that it's enough to have the definition of the thing in a field of transformation, in a group of transformation, to know its value. So meaning and sign are not different. Value and things are not different. It's at the same time that you get the thing and its value. So think of that from a metaphysical point of view. It means that meaning is not something to be given. Meaning is not something missing. Meaning is in the things, right? So if you get the formula of how things come to be, you get the value, you get the meaning. You get everything that is supposed to be added to it. So that meets some currents in contemporary thought and contemporary anthropology, like Latour, for instance. But also, it came with a particular argument about anthropology and about the epistemology of anthropology. Because as I've said, according to my understanding, anthropology is basically a way of acquiring a form of knowledge that is based only on variation. So to me, this is an extraordinary discovery. I was very, very happy to realize that, because it means that you don't need to get any other information than I could be different. I could be different. So in the text that has been circulated, that you might have read, I try to elaborate on that and to explain how that can work. That is, how we can produce the kind of knowledge that is only based on that. So you can suspend all your judgments about everything. You only keep this supposedly very skeptic and relativistic point, which is it could be different. And with that, you actually built a form of knowledge. So this is a particular understanding of the epistemology of anthropology. It's actually a very radical one. because it says that anthropology is not about societies, it's not about cultures, it's not about representations, it's not about symbols, it's just about how we could be different and how we could redefine ourselves through display of variations. And then I met Eduardo Viveiros de Castro at the time, because for various reasons he was of interest to me in that debate. And his epistemology of anthropology is very similar to that. But they came, him, Descola, Latour, to that conclusion from a different perspective. And it's very easy. If you say that anthropologists are interested in the kind of knowledge you can get through becoming different, then you have to, you cannot start with presuppositions that would actually be contradictory to what those people actually that you want to virtually become hold as true. And the concept of culture happens to be one of them. So if you say that everybody has a culture and that anthropologists work on cultures, then the problem is that you end up saying something that doesn't do justice to the people you actually want to become. You cannot become them with this concept in mind, right? Why? Well, because many people actually are not interested in the distinction between nature and culture, and they actually don't think, that's one of Eduardo's points, they actually don't think that we differ through cultures. They think that we differ through our bodies, not our cultures. And they actually argue that the Amazonian ontology, according to Eduardo, they actually argue that all the beings that are capable of being a subject, that are capable of being like me, that's a likeness thing, that is the only thing I am interested in, not even the notion of subject, it's likeness, just like me. All those beings that are like me see the world the same way I do. So their representations are all the same. They don't differ with their representations. What is different is actually their position in the predatory networks. So if you want to be true, to listen to that, to take that seriously, was Isabelle Stengers, that I should have mentioned too. How gross of me, I forgot Isabelle Stengers. Don't draw any conclusion from that, because she's a woman. But it's, so if you want to be polite, as Isabelle Stengers very nicely says, then you cannot start with the notion of culture. So there is a whole redefinition of anthropology beyond the divide between nature and culture. A lot of people are very excited by that, but my claim is that it's based on a very strong epistemological claim about the epistemology of anthropology, and that it has fascinating ontological and metaphysical consequences, but it doesn't require from us to get away with the notion of the sign, basically. And because in fact the sign was only that. So we don't need to oppose. This is what is in the air. So you are being told that you have to choose between speaking about being itself or speaking about ways of speaking about being. Well, what I'm arguing is that there is no reason to choose. So I would suggest that we don't buy into this distinction actually, and that we go beyond the divide between being and sign in general. So that's the general debate. And again, this is, my position is just one position. For instance, Descola's work is slightly different, but maybe Pete, you will say something about that. Descola's work, when he speaks of ontologies, he doesn't claim to produce himself an ontology. And I think this is actually something that is too restrictive. I argue in favor of a merger between metaphysics and anthropology, thanks to the notion of comparison. So comparison is powerful enough to be at the same time a form of critical knowledge. It's critical because we redefine ourselves through the process of transformation. An empirical knowledge, because you actually get to know things. And a form of metaphysical inquiry. So it's very rare, I think, in the history of mankind that you have those three things at the same time. I think it's actually a very interesting moment in thought. Voilà, that's my introduction to you.
Good. Okay, thank you, and thank you, Gabriel, for having us. Now, I have just arrived last night by plane, which means I decided to write something versus speak extemporaneously because I'm jet lagged, and I also have a kind of problem with my eye right now, which has it swollen. So this is why I'm wearing sunglasses now. It's not.
It looks cool.
It looks cool, but it's not to be pretentious, I assure you. It's so that I don't have to imagine you gazing at.
I'm a bit disappointed by the nails, though, because our normal nails.
They're not those nails. I'll try to gesture them
next time.
So I'll briefly speak about let's say the anthropologist's point of view on the things Patrice addressed. And I won't speak about my own work until we begin discussing together, because my work is challenging. I'm an anthropologist of religion, in a way. Sometimes what's called a contemporary psychological anthropologist. So I'm an anthropologist of what you might call madness and possibly the irrational. And I work on a kind of spirit mediumship called channeling. Now, many of the propositions of the mediums I work with, the channels, would be difficult for many of you. They would be shocking. They would be offensive. They would be crazy. They would be hard to entertain as theory and even as metaphysics, which is what I claim they are. So we come to that later, because it's not a starting point. You have to have some idea of how some of us doing something called the ontological turn think. So we'll come to that. So first, let me give you a series of 4 or 5 propositions about the significance of this kind of anthropology that Patrice has gestured to, and a kind of thinking that we might provisionally call philosophy, that takes place within that anthropology in conjunction with it. Now, it's been opened up by Eduardo Villegas de Castro, as he's mentioned, also the British feminist anthropologist of Melanesia, Marilyn Strathern. And we can call this anthropology, for our purposes, perspectival anthropology. And I want to say that it has something of a fundamental role to play in the various sorts of intellectual work that we sometimes call critical theory. So that is this kind of anthropology that is often grouped under the heading of the ontological turn in the discipline, and certain philosophical projects that we can associate with it. That of Latour, also Isabelle Stengers, and even Patrice, who I think has his own emerging system or approach. He sometimes calls it variational ontology. This conjuncture of anthropology and philosophy shares a set of interpretive principles and something of a metaphysical vision that are engendering intellectual and critical perspectives that would not otherwise be available to us. Now, anthropology of this kind is therefore neither just one human scientific discipline among others, nor is it, as some of its practitioners think, a sort of ultimate human science that would render philosophy and theory redundant. It might instead be something of a theoretical virus, I want to say, that can enter other disciplines and reset and redirect some of their intellectual habits. Now, the concept, and this is my second proposal, the concept propelling this sort of anthropology, the idea that is at once its most unique invention and the primary matter of its intellectual interest, we could say the thing by which it sees the real stitched together and constituted is something Patrice did not mention, is equivocation, and the various concrete existing, we could say real world equivocations that it exposes and tries to think through. Now, so what do Villegas de Castro, his friends, and myself, what do we mean by this obscure and somewhat scholastic sounding term? Now, unlike what it might seem, we don't mean the ambiguous or even properly indeterminate meanings of terms within literary and cultural texts that would be generated by aspects of their language that are connotative and rhetorical rather than denotative and grammatical. Equivocations are instead radical discrepancies of meaning between some of the central terms that are apparently held in common by modern and other modes of thought and practice, such as modern and indigenous notions of human or culture, and that exists because the foreign term is very much or even hyper-determinate due to its foundational role in constituting or arranging the real. That is, in organizing what we call an ontological distribution sometimes, in the collectives in which those terms belong. Now, those terms play that part by virtue of being a central referent, we could say, in other collectives' discourses. In fact, such terms might be best thought of, to put in a rough semiotic way, as signs that seem to coincide with a reference. Equivocations are the point of contact between between ontological distributions that make each of those distributions perceptible to us in the first place, and at which they become incommensurate with each other and engender reciprocal misunderstandings. The task of anthropology is to locate the equivocations that have afflicted moderns in their encounter with other distributions, or by which moderns have in fact afflicted others, and then to translate the other set of terms at the heart of the equivocations, and to do so in a way that works with rather than against the equivocations. This is a method, as Eduardo Viveros de Castro sometimes puts it, of controlled equivocation, which does not mean to control the equivocations, to try to render meaning unequivocal, but to work with them in the way that we work with falling, as he says, when we walk. That is, the point is to translate in a way that does not try to dispel an equivocation with a more fundamental, universal, or univocal shared language, common sense, or world, but instead maintain the referential disjuncture that the equivocations expose. Now, my third proposition is that perspectival anthropology also indeed carries out what Viveros de Castro might seem to have only hyperbolically called the decolonization of thought. That is, anthropology undoes certain effects of colonialism if we understand colonization to have engendered the planetary, ambient thought form and thought space that Walter Mignolo and Annabel Chiano have called coloniality. Despite the bad press that it sometimes gets, coloniality is a serious idea. It is that the political, economic, and socio-historical situation of colonialism is distinct from the persistent hegemony that Occidental ontology maintains over the thinking of most human collectives, both through specific institutional discourses, religious, legal, scientific, and also as a kind of diffuse imaginary that can make that ontological distribution appear to be the only rationally feasible and humanly desirable one among other actual distributions. In other words, coloniality could be said to describe the still effective condition according to which it seems natural to think that properly modern scientific and political ideas in the end contain more truth than other kinds of thought, and are thus even quasi-necessary, even if only retroactively. It's also a condition in which, additionally, any self-actualized, flourishing subject would aspire to think such modern ideas, rather than believe in superstitions, myths, erroneous medical knowledge, and so-called authoritarian religious discourse, as modern ideas would embody in some way the most respectable and civilized version of human life. Now, although the potential of anthropology to help break up this joint institutional, real, and imaginary form of thought is far from exhausted, it should be pointed out that it has already been actualized for some time within a few different lines of anthropological inquiry, each of which contrasts a part of the ontological distribution of Euro-American modernity with another. And we have maybe 4 or 5 of these kinds of anthropology. The first is that we associate with what the French call the Americanists, the anthropologists that work in lowland South America, in the Amazon as well, or we call that the Amazon sometimes, but also highland areas, Peru, neighboring countries. And they have worked primarily on the absence of the nature-culture distinction among indigenous peoples in those areas. And they've used that to relativize, localize, situate, also expose as contingent that key tenet of modernity, that there's some kind of absolute cut between nature and culture, or between, we could even say, the material and the mental. Now, that is often what we call the ontological turn in anthropology, but we have other kinds of anthropology that have done this. Now, one of these you'll be more familiar with, especially those of you who are American, and my including it in this thing we call the ontological turn is my attempt a bit to redefine it. That would be the anthropology of liberalism and secularism of Talal Asad, Saba Mahmoud, and others, which examines the equivocation between the notions of religion, the subject, tradition, agency, and even what thinking is between modernity and Islamic collectives. Okay, so that's a second kind and we will probably come to that discussion. A third is the anthropology of Strathern and the so-called Melanesianists, which focuses primarily on equivocations between modern and Melanesian notions of person. Melanesian ideas of person are very strange, bizarre, almost unassimilatable to us because they presume kind of a dual state or kind of phase shifting between a state of inner duality that is often in which each half has a different gender, and a state of external duality in which Patrice and I could be one person, Patrice one gender, myself the other, and we move back and forth between this kind of externalized and internalized dual person, which he calls the divisional. Now, Strathern has used that to, we could say, undermine the idea that we have any need for a full universalization of the sex-gender distinction, and that even we ourselves can rethink what we mean by gender in terms of this other distinction. Now, fourth, we often don't think of it as immediately part of this anthropology, but it's the old classic, the original anthropology of science of Latour, in books like Laboratory Life, Science in Action, the theoretical books like We've Never Been Modern or Reduction. Now, this anthropology is also concerned with equivocations, but these are the equivocations that occur among moderns, his name for the Euro-Americans, with respect to nature, culture, and also modernity itself. So Latour exposes that between the manifest discourse of moderns and their tacit discourse, or their diurnal and nocturnal, or their theoretical and practical accounts of themselves, they say two different things about nature, science, modernity, politics, etc. Now, there may be a fifth kind of anthropology, which we would discuss perhaps later in the hour or the 2 hours, which is something I participate in, that Isabelle Stengers practices, if we want to counter among the anthropologists, which is the anthropology of, let's say, the concepts that emerge at the fringes or margins of modernity, that are produced by people like witches, mediums, other irrational parties that are proximate to or participate in practices that we would say involve an engagement with the supernatural. So we have 4 or 5 pathways by which anthropology is involved in this decloning work. Now, these different kinds of anthropology, I should say, are decolonial not merely for demonstrating that the concepts underlying modern institutions are neither universal nor necessary elements of thought, but also because these same concepts are foundational to basic intellectual orientations in humanities and social sciences. So the nature-culture, the human-non-human, the matter-thought distinctions, for instance, continue to undergird both critical theory and forms of contemporary metaphysics, such as speculative realism and object-oriented ontology. And the fact that both ways of approaching humanistic inquiry implicitly or explicitly grant a transcendent role to the opposite pole of these dualisms confirms that both orientations are still operating within a modern ontological framework that they view as either largely impossible or undesirable to question. So the anthropologies that I've described are thus decolonial for rooting out the thick colonial residue, which I would say lies at the bottom of even the most critical and inventive approaches to intellectual work. That's probably my most provocative claim today. Now, I have a couple other propositions which I'll state in telegraphic fashion so we have time to discuss. Now one is that the kind of anthropology that we practice, the kind of metaphysics perhaps that Patrice practices and that some of us do kind of at the juncture of philosophy and anthropology, one of our operating principles is that theory, philosophy, metaphysics, and I think for our purposes we should say critique. None of these, if those are our terms by which to describe, let's say, the most comprehensive, the most thorough form of thought, the kind of the form of thought that encompasses various kinds of projects without totalizing them, that those kinds of thinking should not be kept outside the space of equivocation. Okay, so we would subject those terms to some kind of alteration or transformation through contact with what we might call their alters, just as much as we do the fundamental concepts undergirding them. Okay, so this means that what theory is, what philosophy are, is very much up for grabs. It means at once that it may be altered in some fundamental way through contact with other modes of thought or traditions. At the same time, it can't view those modes as being external to itself. So Amerindian myth, Islamic philosophy or theology, and also the thinking of the sorts of marginal but very systematic thinkers that I engage actually become internal to our intellectual practices, if our intellectual practices are not already externalized in some way that doesn't allow them to stay with themselves. And I would also say that if you follow that route, we have to engage those collectives, the collectives doing that thinking and the individuals producing that kind of thinking, that is the so-called others doing the thinking, as thinkers. So we would treat them either virtually or actually as authors that we would comment on, that we would study, that at times would be on the same plane for us as so-called great theoreticians. Now, well, I'll leave some other claims I have to the side, and we'll discuss. So thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for those very robust presentations. I might begin with a general question for Patrice, but it's also related, I know, to Peter's work. I really appreciated the way in which you situated your encounter with these contemporary debates in terms of a certain history of French thought, and in particular, a history of French thought that looks at the relationship between what's generally called structuralism and whatever you want to call that has come out of or after post-structuralism. In particular, what's called in the Anglophone world a kind of post-structuralism and a deconstruction of Western metaphysics. And it struck me in your presentation, one of the things that you were highlighting is that this shift, or at least a certain understanding of the shift, was much too quick because it just assumed that structuralism perhaps was very rigid and totalizing and needed to be liberated in the name of a liberation ultimately from the metaphysics that plagued structuralism itself. And that so what you're doing is kind of mining structuralism not as something that's a passé discourse, but instead as something that is really a moment of reconfiguration at a profound level. And to put vocabulary on that, it strikes me, I know that your vocabulary is more variation and variability, it strikes me that one of the things that is operative is a relational understanding of epistemology, ontology, and representation. And that a relational understanding is opposed to a kind of substantialist understanding. So instead of there being things that are there that would then have relations, it would be the relations that are constitutive of what are labeled things from the network of relations that constitute them. And that if there's that shift from a substantialist to a kind of relational apprehension, it strikes me that that's ultimately one of the consequences for what it is that you're teasing out. It's a grand claim, is that if we want to think epistemology, ontology, metaphysics, we can bicker about what terms we want to use here, but these categories that have often been delimited in relational terms, then it seems necessary that epistemology not be distinct from ontology, or representation from metaphysics, for instance, and that they are co-constitutive in various ways. And so I guess the first question that I have for you is that is the work that you're doing, this kind of rather robust claim that ultimately segues as well with some of the things that Pete was saying, because it's not that you have nature out here and ontology deals with nature, and then you have culture over here and that's epistemology and representation, but ultimately they're co-constitutive at a certain level. Is that really robust claim a result of a very specific mode of apprehension or approach, which is a relationality or perhaps a variability, as opposed to a more substantializing approach in which you begin with discrete entities?
Okay, thank you, Gabriel. Yeah, the problem with relationality, apart from the fact that I cannot pronounce it well, is that so your presupposition between relation and substance was first, I think, laid out in its complete version by Cassirer in a book called Substance and Function in 1906, or something like that. And it was at the heart of what we call the orthodox version of structuralism. That is this idea that one thing can only be determined in relation to other things. Right. The problem with that is the reason why I use the word transformational or variational is that, in fact, the core intuition of Lévi-Strauss, but in fact we're there in Saussure too, but we don't really mind the authorities here, but the core intuition is this, that is, you cannot, what makes those things, or rather what defines the relation between those things, is how they could be transformed into another system. If you prefer, the systematicity of a system is dependent on the way it could be re-systematized in another way. So that is the notion of group of transformation. In fact, this is the operational notion in Lévi-Strauss. So the question is not how things hold together here. They hold together by the way they could be different as systems. So you have two levels of relationality. And so the classical version of structuralism, even in math actually, is the idea that indeed you define the terms by their relations rather than the other way around. But even in math, that's the Bourbaki program for those of you who are interested in that. It's interesting to see that the very notion of structure in mathematics is actually a comparative notion. That is, algebraic structures and topological structures precisely can be conceived as structures because they differ from one another.
Right.
So it's a notion of group of transformation. So that is the intuition I actually get from structuralism, and the reason why I do is quite simple. It's because one day I read that sentence by Saussure who says Latin doesn't come from, French doesn't come from Latin, French is Latin. And so I realized, okay, the guy who said that cannot be the guy we are taught about. And then I realized that he has a whole theory about comparative linguistics.
Yeah.
And so you can only define a language by the way it could become different. Right. So this is the core intuition of structuralism. And again, it's a great metaphysical intuition. The whole, or the totality, is not defined intrinsically. It's defined extrinsically by the way it could become different.
Right, but then we also have, and this is just a kind of follow-up question on that, because I had Saussure in mind as formulating it in terms of relationality of signification, in which there's not a meaning that is given.
Very often it's understood in terms of a system. It's synchronic.
Yes, and that's precisely the question I want to ask you, is that it strikes me that, of course, one of the classic criticisms of Saussure or structuralist linguistics, for instance, is that, well, then you have to stop time in order to establish the system. And this might get us precisely to the question of variability and why it's important for you as opposed to relationality, for instance. But an issue in listening to both of your presentations, it was something that I was thinking about, is that there's a discussion of systems, different vocabulary, but basically systems of relations, and then the relations between systems of relations. And one issue that has plagued structuralism, at least in certain forms, and that I'd like to hear you on, is, well, how do you define the system that is the system of relations that would be in relation to another system of relations? At one level, you can say these are there's two different languages, for instance. You compare French and English, but of course, from the quote that you just paraphrased from Saussure, we know that it's more complicated than that. And it seems that part of that issue has to do with the historicity of these systems and the dynamism of those systems. Because if they're changing systems, then how do you actually label them as systems? And I just say this in two ways. One is they're historically changing, and the second is that they're geographically or interculturally, if we want to use this vocabulary, they're changing in relationship to other sites of agency within a particular fields. And so how do you delimit a system of relations in order to say that there are relations between different systems of relation?
One thing that must be said is that the theoretical apparatus you use is part of the game. Or to speak like Lacan, there is no meta-language. Il n'y a pas de meta-langage. There is no meta-language. So this is exactly what Pete just said. So the rule of the game is to end up redefining the starting point as a variant of what. So there is no overlooking standpoint by which we can see different systems and compare them. The art of comparison there is really the art of redefining the starting point. So critically reshuffling the conceptual apparatus by which we can Even the notion of relationality. Marion Strader is very interesting in that particular respect, because she showed that that notion of relationality is an equivocation. It could be understood in various ways. So you cannot use it as a kind of meta-linguistic concept that you can transport everywhere. If you really think that relationality is a very important concept, then you should precisely use it as an equivocation. Right. Therefore, explore the variations of your concept through other concepts, and redefine your starting point, the concept that you use at the beginning, by those differences you arrived to.
So then, when you situate it imminently within that, then how would you, because it is something that comes out, we'll get into the details, I hope, in your text, is that there are better or worse ways of framing particular systems of relation, right? I mean, that's one of the main kind of bets and things that you try to demonstrate in this particular text. So the big issue is then, how do you not only make that claim, but how does that play itself out in relationship to a field of other agencies that I take it are also intervening and saying, this is my system of relation, or these are my systems of relations. And so the question of...
Yeah, I guess the answer is very pragmatic. It's what is useful for your inquiry. It's a very experimental exercise. And one thing I would like to say, it's about historical and geographical, because this notion of transformation that we are introducing, I mean, it comes from the discourse, but what does it mean? It means that there are becomings or transformations that are not historical and that are not geographical. That's why I said, you know, it's a virtual transformation, so you could become another one, and there is no limit to that. So for instance, it might be more interesting, so that transformation is not the transformation of actual systems into one another. It's only the redefinition of your starting point in the virtuality of your becomings. And the one who actually understood that very well is Deleuze. That's the reason why so that's why he says, and that is, I think, something that's so important for critical thought today, to understand that history is a very poor critical concept. And it's just one way of organizing transformations of comparison. Right. Just one way. So if you say, well, then you open the field. Yes, we do, but at the same time, the criteria are imminent. Therefore, experimental. You know, you need to go back to find something. Yeah.
Could I answer a question? Because I heard something. I heard something more. Also, something practical in your question that concerned, let's say, concrete politics that may not immediately concern the level of theory if we're being crude about it. Now, so we better understand as a group what we're talking about. Anthropologists like myself, we don't say this or that people or collective, words we use instead of society, because we're kind of post-culturalist in a sense, or post-social. We don't say they have an ontology, okay? And we're often charged with saying that. So for instance, when Gabriel Rockhill says, as I think you saw in the text that was circulated, okay, within many Amerindian collectives, the kind of basic operating assumption is that everything is human. Okay, everything is human. Plants are human. Animals are human. Minerals, stars, even technical objects can be human. They have souls and they have perception. And the means to differentiate, as Patrice mentioned, between these human beings is on the basis of their bodies. Okay, meaning if I have the body of a jaguar, Patrice has the body of a peccary, you have the body of a vulture. Okay. Each of us
completely arbitrarily chosen, I imagine.
To Tennyson.
Usually I put myself at the low point of the predator, jaguar, wolf. But this is in fact how we're able to distinguish ourselves, even though we know each of us is human. And then you will see Patrice as a peccary, but he will see you as a human being because you're higher in the predatory chain. Right. Okay. Now,
that's what you must say. That yes. the definition of a body is by what it eats and what it is eaten by. It's really with
Okay.
Jattery ontology.
Okay, so there is what he calls what Eduardo calls a multi-naturalist ontology, or it's we could say ontological distribution within this set of assumptions. Okay, now when Eduardo claims that, he's not saying that every person you would talk to in such collectives would consistently report that this is the case. He's also not saying that indigenous peoples are not violently forced, and note that I'm saying this, or you misunderstand this, violently forced to inhabit a modern distribution in which nature and culture are in fact are the operative terms, and in which the human is a foundational term, but in a way that is violently excluding. So it's not a question of, let's say, essentialist ascriptions of difference to this or that people. The equivocation allows for, we could say, a kind of comparative operation that allows you to see that in some ways the two distributions are there, they're real. In fact, there is, they do diverge. There is a problem with translation. And at the same time, to say in a more historical or sociological sense, in certain contexts, indigenous people, the whole problem is they're forced to deal with the disparity and the conflict between these two distributions. And you have a great deal of work on that. So this is, so I think that gets at what you're
But can't you say that this is a form of critical knowledge? That I think is the reason why we must not drop the notion of critique, and we should think that this is just one step further in the history of critical theory, precisely, or critical activity, because why is Eduardo interested in the Amazonian the Amazonian population that we work with? It's precisely because they have a very strong critical impact on the basics of his anthropology or anthropology. So we are, again, the other is a critical point, and the success of the operation is the success of a critical point, in the sense that you're moved, you redetermined in another way, not only but what you think, but actually also maybe what you do, be transformed in the very way you behave. You know.
Actually, it's precisely on this point that I wanted to come back to the material that Peter presented, because it strikes me that particularly in your insistence on the relationship between some of these contemporary debates and the category of coloniality, that there's something very interesting. I could almost frame it in the same way as I framed the question to Patrice, as a kind of historical inversion of sorts, in the sense that anthropology, at least according to many accounts, was founded in the 19th century in Europe in order to give a scientific account of so-called backwards or savage people, in order to then harness them to the wagon of European colonialism. Now, we could get into the details of whether or not that is indeed the case, but people have made that argument. And one of the things that you're showing in both giving us the landscape, but then I take it as well in your personal work, is that there's a way in which anthropology certainly doesn't have to be reduced to that, and in fact, there is a very strong possibility for anti-colonial critique. And I want to hear you more on, because you gave us a few different options, of the options that you find to be the strongest and where you think it's important to push, because you highlighted in particular the nature-culture divide. Just before that, as you collect your thoughts, so it strikes me, and you don't necessarily have to respond to this, but there's also a parallel trajectory, and that is that given that I know you also have some background, a fair amount of background in philosophy as well, there's a way in which philosophy often has defined itself, or tried to define itself, as quintessentially Western, and told itself stories about being born in ancient Greece and being linked to a kind of European, quote-unquote, democratic heritage and things like this. And the idea that you would, and I think both of you were kind of saying this earlier, that it's not just that there are philosophers who come from Europe who would think about people elsewhere, but instead to invert that entire relation and to take seriously the philosophies produced elsewhere. And so I'd like to hear you a bit more on the kind of political stakes, but then also what it means not to think other people, but to recognize their thinking as a radical variation, to pick up on Patrice's vocabulary from earlier, that does not necessarily, that produces equivocations, if you will.
Yeah, now you have to excuse me if I'm a bit low to the ground in my answer, because I sense that some of that is needed, and some of that is needed because many of you, I'm sure, are scratching your heads and saying, but I know some anthropologists at the university I'm at, and they don't want to have anything to do with philosophy, let alone critical theory. They're all empiricists. They talk about Max Weber and Durkheim, but nothing contemporary. Maybe they're best Marxists, and so we have some additional disciplinary translation to do. First, I'll say, we could of course contest those accounts of anthropology. As an anthropologist who feels no identification with his discipline, as most anthropologists do, I think I could say without much investment that the bashing of anthropology as the quintessential colonialist discipline is I've never quite understood it, because we don't bash English literature that way, which is also a colonialist discipline. We don't bash history that way, which can be very colonialist discipline, et cetera, et cetera. And the history of anthropology with respect to colonialism is of course a fraught one, but let's say it's full of abject failures in which there's complicity with colonial violence, and also attempts to work against that, which I'm not saying are good or virtuous. It's just what they are. So I would just say, I would ask your patience in not sticking with that image of anthropology if you haven't. Now, if what you're hearing still, which I believe you suspect some people might, given your question, is that there's still a kind of colonial operation at stake, or occurring among some of these anthropologists who, what do they study? They study so-called primitive peoples. They study them as objects, it could sound like, and it sounds like no matter what we say, they may not be thinking with them. I want to emphasize that really the agency of thought is always conceived as taking place in collectives which by default, okay, in principle, if we follow out to its logical conclusion, a lot of the principles of critical theory, by default are not thinking. They're not thinkers. They don't make a positive contribution to thought as such. What do I mean by that? Well, if we look at the history of, let's say, the Subaltern Studies Collective and their work in South Asia, the attempt to find agency in peasant revolts, political agency that would be recognizable within older versions of Marxist theory as in fact political, involved always finding points of commensurability between Marxist notion of agency and, let's say, notions of agency ascribed to peasants. So if the peasants had their economic or political interests at stake, but in masked or veiled symbolic terms, we had agency. Now, Dipesh Chakrabarty appeared and said, okay, but you guys are still, okay, you, the Subaltern Studies Collective, not you, the French or British social anthropologists circa 1950. You, Ranaji Guha, for example, are still playing a game in which you don't get outside, let's say, some kind of Eurocentrism. Because if a god, to take a famous case, inspires a group of peasant workers agrarian workers to revolt, the language of the social sciences, even critical theory, doesn't say the god is an agency, that the god could be an aspect of agency, and that we have political interests in play, right? We have religious interests that are in a sense pre-political. Now, Chakrabarty was the first in a way to teach us that we need to preserve those points of incommensurability, or those equivocations. Here the equivocation is with respect to agency, rather than immediately, in the name of our best critical impulses, reduce them, dispel them, and immediately assimilate them back to our way of thinking. Now, I would argue that Eduardo and this entire movement in anthropology goes a step further than Chakrabarty and even some of the best post-colonial theory, because it insists that, in fact, we're not stuck in a place Chakrabarty often says we're stuck, which is, let's say, sheer incommensurability, in which something remains absolutely untranslatable. For instance, Chakrabarty says, well, what we see in the peasant revolt is a possibility, something that is possible for us, but we can never imagine inhabiting if we're truly modern. if we're people of writing, the Enlightenment, the critical social sciences, etc. What takes place in this kind of anthropology is first we do create, invent conceptual means in conjunction with the thinking of the other collectives, by which to say, no, we have another kind of agency. Okay, so even as an analytic device, we're able to pinpoint that agency is present. At the same time, we do alter our concepts in a way through translation. We say something is translatable. In fact, translation most happens when you have incommensurability. When you have a point at which things seem to be initially discontinuous between modern thought and some other form of it. In fact, translation generates more continuity than exists in the places where there's commensurability. When that happens, we go much farther in a decolonial operation because we're actually thinking in terms that we're not supposed to be able to think with. Yes, we translate. Yes, we never fully inhabit those terms, but we find not through a full translation or a perfect translation, but one that in fact never quite works. We find a way to think with another set of terms. In fact, that generates concepts for us. So okay, this is a bit of a circuitous way of answering your question.
No, but I see what you mean. I'd be curious because it's also something that comes out in Patrice's piece, because there is obviously there's a very radical redefinition of and very unique understanding of anthropology. I'm thinking, for instance, Patrice defines it at one point in time as a formal ontology of ourselves as variants, which is not at least a standard dictionary definition of the term, but I think that's also kind of what Pete was describing in a concrete example. There is, in the work that both of you are doing, clearly something that you find better, more productive, more useful in this understanding of anthropology than, for instance, just allowing practices to be. So why is it, for instance, because at one level, and this might just kind of further dig into the problem that, or the question that you just raised, Pete, at a certain level, you could ask the question, well, why do the Amerindians need Viveros de Castro? And it would seem like a very quick response is, well, they don't, in order to establish at least their own practices. But is there something that, and I don't know what we'd want to call it, is there a reflexivity? Is there a comparison between different systems of variability? Why would we still need anthropology? Why wouldn't we just indulge in variation? Outside of this kind of reflexive attempt to account for all of these systems of variation, if you will. Is that clear as a question?
You mean, why wouldn't I just let ourselves become different, or is that what you're...
For instance. Yeah, I mean, if that's the goal or the objective or the...
Well, for me, at least, okay. There is so for me, the anthropology and what I'm doing belongs to a particular tradition, which is the tradition of critical thinking, so the Enlightenment, if you will. And I have absolutely no problem with that. So it's, again, a further step in the same, or through the same impetus. And I think we should actually claim that position, and we should not pretend that we're speaking from nowhere. So I think it's more reasonable to do that if we want to do anthropology as it has always been done, but better, as it's always supposed to be. If we want to do philosophy as it has always been done, but better, and so on and so on. So that would be my first answer. But then I think you're raising some issues which are quite important for today's life, really, which is that one reason why we need that form of, let's say, pluralistic thinking, but I'm not very happy with pluralistic because it means that there are various things here and there. That's why, again, transformational thinking or metamorphic thinking. So for me, the main reason is that, so coloniality implies that contact has been made and we will not get out of it. It's not that. We will not get out of it just like that. We will need to make a number of things, but people could take that distance. That's very possible and very acceptable. But whatever they do, they will have to do it in that context in which there has been a form of hegemony. Mm-hmm. So I think anthropology is a kind of counter-hegemonic exercise. But more than that, I think the climate warming means that whatever we do here impacts some other place which is very distant. And even if the Arawate that Eduardo has lived with, even if they decided not to be in contact with the Brazilian state and with any of the Brazilian population, actually they will be in contact with you and me, with all of us. So in that context, so the question is, that's why I usually say the Earth is a big equivocation, the one we cannot really escape. It's not a matter of, it's not optional. It's not that we can say, well, maybe kinship somehow, if you're not interested in kinship, but the Earth is actually something you have to share. You will not get out of it. And so here you have two options. Either you think that there is one way of looking at the Earth, which is a kind of authoritative way through climate sciences, geoengineering, international political bodies that would manage from above, in a way, this one thing that we are taken within. It's something we are within. So maturity is not on the other side. It's like I like actually Spivak's book of the depth of a discipline, when she compares Heart of Darkness with that book by Mahashweta Diva, I think she's named, because she says something like that. Maturity is not at the end of the road in the forest now. Maturity is within us all the time, and we are within it, in fact, even more than it's within us. So either you have a kind of overarching, overlooking standpoint to understand what the Earth is, what is the common ground that we have to share, or you think, well, we need to engage into some form of comparative exercise so that precisely we don't continue, in a way, that history of two things, because of both political violence, but also intellectual stupidity. And I want to emphasize that political violence is bad, of course, okay, but intellectual stupidity is bad too, right? So politics, we tend to think in the critical world that politics, is the ultimate. But no, we have the right to say, no, it's just, it's bad knowledge, bad science, and that is a very good reason for not doing it. Politics should not come like the thing that decides. So yeah, I don't know if that answers to your questions.
Well, given the way you just framed this, I think it's probably a good moment to open up as well and see if there are larger questions, comments, incisive criticisms. Jeanne?
Yes, so thank you first for the conversation. So you all mentioned that anthropology was an operation of transformation of ourselves, and this is what makes it crucial for nowadays. But anthropology is also a practice, and to which extent this transformation also happens to the collective the anthropologists interact with.
The collective, the anthropologists.
Interact with, yeah.
You mean the collective of the anthropologists, or the collective?
No, the collective, the other.
The other.
And what are the political implications of that as well?
Well, something that often we forget to say in discussing this conjuncture of anthropology and philosophy is that because it takes as its point of departure a critique of representation in the epistemological, philosophical sense, but it's very interested in doing something pragmatic with or alongside its thinking. In fact, there's no thinking that doesn't immediately intervene in the real or being. Being is in the making, so to speak. And so anthropologists have in various ways imagined and then put into practice different kinds of interventions like you're speaking of. Now, I think the most important one to mention is it resulted in a book called it's translated in English as the Falling Sky, and this is a collaboration between a Yanomami shaman and a political leader, Dabi Kobenawa, and a French anthropologist, Bruce Albert. And this is a book in which Albert, in a sense, plays something like secretary, or in the sense of film, the film editor to Kobayawa's production. And over the course of 10 years, Albert transcribes speeches that Kobayawa makes, and eventually edits them to a kind of book, the purpose of which is to speak directly to us. And I use the us because it means that the us is everyone in this room. And to state something about the political situation of the Yanomami, about the specificity of their cosmology, but also say something to us about the reasons for global warming. Now, this is a remarkable book in many ways. Some of us see it as the best outcome of this kind of anthropology, because Kobayawa really speaks to us as a kind of thinker, as a kind of theoretician, and as someone doing critique, but doing critique on the basis of another kind of thinking. So this seems at first like, okay, it's a book, it's not the kind of intervention that you might be asking about, but in fact for me, that's the kind of transformation that we could see as being entirely positive, in which and laudable. Kobayawa goes without leaving, let's say, his conceptual territory. He is able to direct something from it towards us, and it's that kind of collaboration. Almost sounds too neoliberal, but it's that kind of work across the space of divergence that we strive for. So it's an example.
Ian, do you want to?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, thank you both. I have a question. It's mainly directed towards Patrice, but I'm interested to hear what has something to say about it as well. I noticed in your talk too, as well as in the article, you have kind of a consistent commitment to viewing metaphysics as being science, right? That's kind of the way that you frame the article. And you're relying on a lot of figures in the Western tradition to kind of get this idea as metaphysics as a proper science, right? It has scientific methods. But there's another aspect of this tradition that you're talking about, where metaphysics is not just science, but it's the queen of the sciences, right? I don't see that being stressed as much, and I'm wondering. So I actually think that this is really important, right? Because if metaphysics is the queen of the sciences, or the highest science, or kind of the grounding of all of the sciences, Husserl, in recounting Western philosophy, would say something like, all the sciences are just kind of branches of philosophy in this sort of way. Then it seems like science is always doing metaphysics in a certain way. Scientific, like when scientists get together and they're figuring things out, that it always has metaphysical meaning. And to translate that to your language, that it would always be comparative anthropological meaning, right? It's kind of easy to imagine how scientists are actually turning themselves into different people by doing the research, right? In a certain way, there's a transformation that happens in your language. But then I'm wondering, how does that go with the claim that you're making also, that you made here, that this type of anthropology that you're talking about is counter-hegemonic, right? If it's already sort of happening all of the time, I mean, how counter-hegemonic could it actually be?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure to understand why it's happening everywhere all the time, because comparison is a very specific method and a very restrictive one to some extent. That is, again, you suspend the use of concepts like society, culture, and even matter, whatever, and you only use those equivocations by which you enter into forms of variation. So what I'm arguing is that this is a specific form of scientific method, which is actually not at all the one that is used in the various fields of biology or physics or whatever. It's a very specific method that was really designed by, in linguistics, in anthropology, in the course of the 19th century. Right, it's comparative linguistics that really started the game, but with an understanding of comparison that I actually don't share, right? Because the position of the comparative scientist is actually outside of the comparative field, whereas I'm arguing that the real task of comparison is actually to put us back on the map of the variance. So not only comparison is a very specific method, but my understanding of comparison is itself quite specific. And it's so that's one thing. But you're right. I mean, your position is, in some way, it gets back to Jean's question too, because yeah, of course, metaphysics for me is not the queen of sciences. Metaphysics is a very particular, peculiar endeavor that not everybody engages in, and then not everybody has to. And so my definition of metaphysics is a kind of knowledge without presupposition, as much as you can. Without presupposition. You're trying to retrieve the presupposition, or rather to get rid of all the presupposition, and you see whether you can still know something or not. This is the metaphysical doubt of Descartes and that kind of things. This is a very traditional definition of metaphysics. But I think your question really hits really at the heart of a very important question today, which is the definition of metaphysics in what I would say a flat space of disciplines, where metaphysics, or actually philosophy for that matter, is not again above and outside of those disciplines, but just next to them. And Bergson actually, and Deleuze, argued for that kind of understanding of the relation between philosophy and other disciplines. So philosophy doesn't tell the truth about other disciplines or other practices. Philosophy is just one practice, among others, which can bring things. And again, I think philosophy or metaphysics is itself, I believe, a transformation of conceptual practices that it cannot encompass. So just let me give you an example. I think what we do when we do metaphysics today is a variant of what David Kopelawa does when he dreams, that is when he takes drugs and has visions. And this is very interesting because that means that philosophy is just a particular, it's not that his shamanism is a particular form of speculation. That speculation is a particular form of vision, as he calls it, of dreaming. And so this is the kind of variation that I would argue for. And so the word, I realized, in fact, because I used that word metaphysics, I don't know how to pronounce that in English, and I realized it was in fact in your conversation with Eduardo, and I had completely forgotten. I thought I had made up that word. So, metaphysics is metaphysics, which metaphysics means, well, it's another way of narrating things. And narrating maybe, it's another way of designing a situation, of producing visions. But myth and elite sciences are too. And so I agree with you. I mean, we cannot really define metaphysics as a queen of science. Certainly not. We must not.
Ashley? I'm kind of taking a list, so if you want to get in, then just show me a sign. But Ashley.
Thanks. Thanks for your comments. I have a question for Peter. So in looking at this sort of five-pronged taxonomy of perspectival anthropology that you offer us, I have two very serious concerns about naming all five of these decolonial.
Okay.
And I'll give you both. So the first concern comes from, I think it is most easily viewable in, let's say, the first and the third. Insofar as there are tons of Americanist anthropologists who are looking at the so-called Americas, or indigenous people of the Americas, who do so in a way that I don't think we would necessarily see as in line with the decolonial politics, right? They can engage in anthropology in ways that are exoticizing, that are Eurocentric, even if they are involved in a certain kind of attempt even maybe to do decolonial work, right? There's often a space between that attempt and the realization of that attempt. So that's one thing.
May I ask you, and it's okay if you don't want to say this, but who are you thinking of, just so I have a better idea? Some of these other anthropologists.
I mean, I'm speaking sort of generally, right? I'm interested in why we're necessarily interested in calling these decolonial. I'm interested in the weight of the conceptual terrain there, is sort of what to put my cards on the table.
Okay.
And my second concern here is specifically with points 4 and 5, the sort of anthropology of modern science equivocations among modernity, and let's say sort of positions, those that interrogate concepts on the fringes of modernity. Witchcraft, sorcery, insanity, potentially, whatever. And I'm just interested in whether this is really decolonial, especially when we're looking at someone like Mignolo, like Quijano, who are particularly interested in analyzing coloniality both as a sort of structure of hegemonic power that has certain relationships to science, ontology, progress, et cetera, but specifically does so within a discourse that is racialized and that is about capitalism, right, for both of them. And if we were to go further down the decolonial line and talk about someone like Maria Lugones, would also be about race, about gender and sexuality. And so I'm interested in classifying someone as like Bruno Latour, who as far as I can tell, couldn't care less about race or capitalism, as this sort of arch figure of decoloniality. And my worry here is about the depoliticization of that which is specific to the decolonial challenge to modernity, given that there are a variety of histories inside Western modern thought of contending the very conceptual terrain of that sort of figure, right? So I don't want to say that, like, well, because Nietzsche has a different idea of what it means to be an individual than someone else, or because Berkeley is an idealist rather than a materialist, that means they're necessarily decolonial, right? Like, just because European figures are contesting that which they inherit doesn't mean, and even if they're contesting science or reason or something, doesn't mean they're necessarily doing so in a way that is decolonial. So
well, in Bruno's case, of course, it's not decolonial in a way that involves, that doesn't require some kind of explication and interpretation of his thought in a way that would make it immediately compatible with Mignolo. I agree with you about that, of course. At the same time, as far as I understand Mignolo, it would be a good thing to situate the natural sciences instead of according them implicitly some kind of universality, which, for example, we do when we say, I contest, and when I teach about this, I often teach students who are Chicana or identify as indigenous, who initially are skeptical in exactly the way you are. And I'm not trying to say with the same level of knowledge, etc. But I think that when we say, we have other practices of knowledge, indigenous practices of knowledge, I think this is a problem because we've assimilated certain ways of thinking to science then. And so this is actually why we need something like the sociology or anthropology of science, even if we're not content with its entire political vision. And at the same time, in many of these contexts, the exclusion of animals and what we would call geological elements as political agents, that's been a condition of not engaging people politically. So Cano begins, as far as I understand it, in fact, taking what was the typical Marxist position during the Cold War and saying these are not indigenous people, they're peasants, they're agrarian workers. The Indian is gone. And there are analyses, they're not mine, that say that the development of his later work was actually a way of sort of reversing the violence of this. So if Bruno thinks that we should have, that parliaments in a way should include non-human actors, this is a way within modernity of altering something we think that may actually lead concretely, immediately to, or eventually to something of political consequence. So that's one answer about Bruno, but I wouldn't want to make that entirely about him. And I understand that it's strange that I would say that he's involved in this. As for witchcraft, there's less, I think, less of a problem to speak to. I mean, the claim of people working on this, and even of people we wouldn't recognize immediately as being thinkers or doing critique. So I'm thinking of the witch Starhawk, if you've heard of her. Is that, and I think she's right historically. She says capitalism doesn't start without the persecution and purging of witches, because here you have people who have a relational tie to what we call land. Land is itself a kind of naturalist, violent abstraction, something that we see as animist. And you know, the same the displacement of indigenous people from the Brazilian frontier takes place for the same reasons today. It's precisely that here you have people who don't recognize land as something that can be owned, who recognize themselves as being part of it, who hold what is sometimes called an animistic relation to it. And so you have Brazilian anthropologists and others today saying, in a way, we're seeing a repeat of the 17th century there. Now, I understand that a lot of people that identify as doing decolonial theory or critique don't immediately see the link to anthropology, but I often find them to be saying very similar things. And that's why I would emphasize even this kind of thing as being, I mean, that's a strong vector of the decolonial theory. But remember, everything I've focused on, and I hope I've been clear, is on the work we can do within the intellectual space of the human sciences so that our concepts are less violent. We'll continue. I see I didn't satisfy you with that.
Well, thanks to both of you for coming. I've been kind of curious about this development in anthropology, so it's been nice to get to know a little bit more.
Can you talk a bit about it?
Sure. I've been curious about this development in anthropology, so it's nice to get to know a little bit more and hear from you directly. I'm kind of picking up on Jean's question about anthropology as a practice, and I want to kind of ask after the notion of critique that's being employed when you stress, and I think either of you might answer this question, but when you stress the ontological turn or the metaphysical turn in anthropology as a kind of critique. And so I'm going to try to reconstruct what you're saying and then try to show you why I'm not super convinced that if critique is kind of articulated with an eye to social transformation, that this kind of anthropological practice can actually be characterized wholly as a critique. So you want to say that this metaphysical turn in anthropology is radical in that it undermines the most basic and pervasive dualisms of modern thought. And I'm wondering whether this is useful without a politics. So I've read a few of the books in this canon about kind of that purport, I guess, a kind of environmentalism or concern about non-humans, the existence of non-humans, but have no kind of explanatory diagnostic critique of the way that we have come to think about non-humans, the way that we do, or as lacking agency, or what have you. So I wonder whether the practice of your anthropology doesn't presuppose like an epistemology that, oh, sorry, I wrote it down, I get a little nervous. But I wonder whether this practice doesn't betray an epistemology that would posit something that you might want to contest, which is to say that just because we come to know that another possibility exists, we're going to be able to change our minds, or for instance. So I'm thinking in particular in the philosophical tradition of Stanley Cavell's distinction between knowing and acknowledging. So I'm thinking of this practice, you know, Eduardo Kohn goes to Ecuador, he writes this book about forests, and I wonder how this practice of you know, it might be something that is a process of resubjectification for the person doing the ethnographical work, but I wonder to what extent the production of this kind of knowledge actually contributes to the project of social change more broadly, not for the person doing the ethnographic work, but in the context in which they're producing knowledge. So I'm thinking, for instance, of that there might be a kind of epistemological betrayal of something that your position might want to reject, which is to say that just because one comes to know that another possibility exists, that possibility will somehow enact change. Like, for instance, I know that gender is socially constructed, and yet one really needs to acknowledge those kinds of things in order to see the project of social change flourish. So I guess I'm wondering if you could speak to the kind of epistemology, I don't know if this is convincing at all, that underlies some of this claim to critique in the turn. And I think either of you might be able to answer it, but yeah.
Yes. As I said, I'm a little unconvinced, really, by this stress on politics, social change that people in academia really want to put forward. I think it's
what people are those?
In general, you know, I mean, in political theory, you know, we always ask, okay, what is the political impact of what you're doing?
Okay, sorry.
I'm trying to do what I'm doing well, and this is the political impact of what I'm doing, because other people maybe do it badly, and this is actually political in itself. That's one thing.
But couldn't you say that a nuclear scientist who's making bombs is doing that well,
Sure,
or someone
sure,
firing in an F-16? Yeah,
you could.
So
Just a political, I mean, a nuclear. No, of course, no. We can come back to that, but we can start with the idea that we might not immediately jump to the question. Okay, what are the consequences of what you are doing? Maybe we could also, there are various possibilities here. Some of them are intrinsically more productive. Some are, so if you have a nuclear scientist who actually gets all the funding but doesn't bring anything to nuclear physics, that's also a problem. So, I don't know, I really would like to bring that idea back, that it's, what we do when we do theory might have its intrinsic, imminent value and criteria. So, I don't know. This is what's not. There's a general thing.
But you could speak to the epistemological question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But so the so what is the question again?
The idea is that even in your proposal of kind of the project of anthropology as a project of re-subjectification, self-alteration, and new ways of feeling and experiencing, you seem to want to say that knowledge is not something that one kind of picks up, just like, propositionally, that it's not simply cognitive.
I understand
you want to say it's embodied, but the kind of practice of comparative metaphysics that is being described in this kind of turn, it seems to be presupposing something else, that I can show you this information, look, there's such and such a practice that exists, this practice undermines our split between nature and culture, and then voila.
That is a good point.
Yeah.
But you said, that's what I wasn't sure to understand, because you said, you gave the example of Eduardo Cohn, who actually might experience a re-subjectification through his fieldwork, his many years of fieldwork there. And so I insist in the article, I actually insist on the fact that this is actually an experience of re-subjectification. So it's not only hearing about the existence of another possibility, it's actually going through it, becoming different, so feeling differently. And that doesn't mean actually that it's only in relation to very exotic populations. That's not what I think. I mean, that could happen to in relation to very local relations, humans and non-humans. So if we have that in mind, then actually your question remains. So we have that experience. So something has happened here. And so again, I'm interested more in the fact that when you do that, then you can actually reconsider in a reflective way the critical apparatus of your own discipline, of your own practice, and try to, as I said, map you back into the field of variant. And that is a way of strengthening the redetermination that you've. So it could be very practical in that sense too. I mean, theory in itself, you could have practical consequences on you. I'm speaking here only of them. Okay, so but still, the question that Jeanne asked, about what's happening in those collectives, and what I want to say that in contemporary anthropology, the collectives who actually welcome anthropologists are very interested in what they say about what they write. So they read, very often they read the text. And it's an interesting epistemological debate, that is, must you write things that are acceptable to the people with whom, to a certain extent, you have written that? Not necessarily about whom, but with whom. And I think you absolutely do, for a strong epistemological reason, because if people who are able to discuss your work say, well, this is actually not at all, you have not understood anything about us or about what I've shown to you, about this initiation I've given you, that should be taken seriously. So this is constant in the. But again, one thing that is the situation today is that it's not that anthropologists go and see people. who are not interested. The first person actually who told me that story is Beth Povinelli. You might know of her. Who, again, I can't say how her work is not decolonial. I think it's a very decolonial work, but she was trained as a philosopher, and she went in Australia for a kind of sort of a summer research, and there, for completely contingent reasons, she worked with some people who actually needed an anthropologist to write their land claims. So they, you know that. But that's a very interesting story, because she's the first anthropologist who was asked to become an anthropologist by the people. So this is how anthropology is actually. And I think this kind of anthropology we are arguing for is good for that, because it's a kind of diplomatic anthropology. It introduces in its very own epistemology the fact that you're not speaking about an object to tell the truth about this object given a set of axioms that you project onto the reality, but in fact you need to redefine yourself. And so in the term of the practice of anthropology, I think it's actually working pretty well. And then think of Eduardo Viveros de Castro in his relation to Amazonian people. What does he do? He tries to voice their position as well as he can, and not to get them completely crushed back onto, for instance, a conception. It's a very concrete question. Is the forest a resource that needs to be preserved? Is that the way we should look at the forest? Well, then the Amazonian people that Eduardo tries to speak with will say, no, this is not at all the way we want us to actually relate to the forest. So how is that not taken into power relationships, a kind of counter-hegemonic activity by which we try precisely to give some room to something that is suppressed otherwise. It's suppressed not because people are evil only, but they are evil and they do kill the Amazonians, but also because they lack imagination. And we should take seriously the fact that people lack theoretical imagination. It's good. I think political. Is that an answer to, yeah?
I might, just as the timekeeper, we should exit the room within about 10 minutes, and I know there are 2 more questions, so maybe I could ask Tim and Larry to both get their questions on the table, and then, yeah, or comment, whatever it might be, because unfortunately, as some of the people already know, they close and lock the building at 7 o'clock, so we have to be out. Tim,
you asked the last question yesterday, so maybe just
yeah.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, I just thank you so much. By the way, that was really interesting. I'm just interested in this sort of potentially little cluster of terms, right? Likeness, relation, equivocal, which all sort of gesture, I feel like, to a similar thing. And I'm interested about how they relate to the idea of radical alterity or a completely other world, right? So Patrice, particularly in your piece, you talk about this idea of a radically other world, a completely other world of which there is no possibility of a relation, right? And the example you use, I think, is a really interesting one. It's like microorganisms, right, in the room, which obviously you have no perception of because they have no effect on you, right? But it seems to kind of speak, right, to how colonial projects often function, because you certainly have an effect on microorganisms in the room, right? You have a catastrophic one sometimes as you kind of walk around and destroy civilizations with an elbow, you know. So, I mean, is there a kind of, is there a question around perception here, the possibility of perceiving another world? I mean, even if we think in really concrete terms about how we go around during the day, people don't get out of bed in the morning generally and decide I'm going to be sexist today, right? They're sexist in all these minuscule kind of micro-political ways of which they're not aware, but the the subaltern or whatever the victim of that violence is aware. So I just wonder if, I mean, is there a way of getting out of that? Surely what we need to do is to think the radically ulterior, the completely unrelated, the completely external, that which we have yet been able to perceive. So possibly it turns into a methodological question, I guess, here. Is science is a science-like thing like anthropology, the best way to do that? Or, maybe following someone like Deleuze is art or philosophy or a creative practice, potentially better equipped to kind of create the radically unknown. So I don't know if that...
Yeah, I guess the quick answer would be as long as the radical other has not come into my horizon, I cannot do much with it. But indeed, I mean, I can change the perceptive apparatuses that I use, so that could be through scientific technologies, but it could be also through listening to people. And so I don't know if that is an answer to your question, but I am a little. Do we really need more? I think what is behind your question is: do we need more than the possibility of becoming other in a continuous and perceptible way? Do we really need? Do we need anything more than a kind of finitude of our horizon? The horizon is finite, but at the same time, there's something beyond, and it doesn't need to be a radically different thing. So it's just something beyond. So from a metaphysical point of view, this is the way I understand your question, and I would say with the infamous Latour that to actually put the radical alterity somewhere is actually what Latour would call a double click. That is to hypothesize something that is in fact continuous fringe of variation into something that is absolute. And I must say, for the purpose of the kind of philosophy and theoretical discipline I have in view, I don't see why it's necessary. And even actually artistic practices are comparative exercises, I would claim. But maybe you're right. I will think of it. Thank you very much.
No worries.
I would say just something very briefly. It's a way to punctuate what he said. I would ask humbly and politely, read David Copenhagen, and decide afterwards whether there's any contemporary art which in fact challenges you as much. Because I think that there's a deeper challenge to our suppositions, even our political suppositions that we're quite sure are the right ones in this kind of thinking. And that's my bias, of course, as someone who doesn't work on contemporary art, etc. But I'm unconvinced that we even know what we're talking about most of the time with this sort of thing.
What I've realized, I mean, working through that, was really that likeness again, ressemblance, resemblance, is an incredibly critical tool, to accept likeness, because then you don't know where it stops, where it starts. You don't have identity and difference. Likeness means it's equivocal. But what you say about non-relationality is something I'm interested to. For instance, I'm thinking of the work of this anthropologist, Nastasia Martin, who wrote her doctoral dissertation with Descola on Arctic people, and precisely those people are interested in wild animals in a way that because wild animals actually retreat in a kind of secret space in a non-relational way, and so I think this is something we must not forget. That is the relational ontology, or even the transformational relational ontology, must not forget that it needs to do justice to non-relationality but in that particular sense, because that actually is here. I mean, it's perceptible in the sense that people actually will change the way they hunt, the way they talk to you. It will take a very long time for you to learn about animals and so on and so on. So that's the one way I would introduce non-relationality. But I see that there is a problem with that.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking both Patrice and